All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Ambassadors Water Experts Program session on river flow forecasting techniques and models. For anyone who might be joining us today for the first time, my name is Elizabeth Goffey, and I am a project manager with the U.S. Department of the Interior's International Technical Assistance Program. My office is pleased to partner with the U.S. Embassy in Baku and the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs on the Ambassadors Water Experts Program, or AWEP. AWEP is a U.S. government platform for the exchange of best practices in conserving water, an increasing challenge for the U.S. and many of our partner countries worldwide. On behalf of the AWEP team and our participating experts, we are so appreciative that you have taken the time to join us today for this third part of our four-part series on sustainable water resources management. We are especially glad to see so many familiar names having joined one or both of our previous sessions. Before I turn things over to today's speaker, I have a few quick reminders. First, today's session is available in both English and Azerbaijani. To select your preferred language, please select the globe icon from the menu at the bottom of the Zoom window. Second, the presentation is being recorded and will be available online shortly after the session. To preserve the audio quality, we encourage folks to stay on mute and use the chat box or the raise hand feature to indicate that they would like to ask a question. There will also be dedicated time for questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, if anyone experiences technical difficulties, please reach out to one of the meeting hosts via the chat and we will do our best to help. With that, I think we're ready to turn things over to our speaker, Donald Anderson. Don, please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'll see if I can go ahead and bring up my screen here with the presentation. And are you seeing my slideshow?
We are.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and a big thank you to a lot of people. Thank you to the U.S. Embassy there in Baku for your assistance in helping to get this whole interchange set up. Thank you to Elizabeth in Washington, D.C. for helping to coordinate from that end, from the United States. A special thanks to our translator and our interpreter. Really appreciative of your availability to provide simultaneous translation for these presentations, which is wonderful. And I will try to speak slowly and clearly so that I can make your job hopefully a little bit easier. And I want to extend a welcome to everybody there in Azerbaijan who's joined the talk today. It's wonderful to have you as part of this discussion, and hopefully we have some useful information to share in today's presentation. By way of introduction, my name is Don Anderson. I am a professional hydrologist here in the United States. For many years, I worked for a couple of different agencies under the umbrella of the U.S. Department of the Interior. One of those agencies was the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is the largest water manager and wholesaler of water in the Western United States under federal government auspices. And I later worked for, and they're also the largest hydropower producer in the Western United States. I also worked for the latter part of my career as the in-stream flow coordinator for the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program. In that role, I sort of served as the seat at the table along with other water users and water managers, speaking on behalf of the endangered fish in the Colorado River system. I interacted a lot with reservoir operators, with water users, with each of the 3 states in the upper basin that share the water supply for the Colorado River, essentially working with those various water interests to ensure enough water in the rivers at the right times and at the right places to help protect and to recover the endangered fish species. So that's kind of my background by way of introduction. Our water team here in the United States thought this topic of river flow forecasting and techniques and models that are used in the United States would be a good follow-up to the really excellent presentation that my fellow water expert team member Michael Strobel gave earlier this month on snow monitoring, snow measurement, and runoff forecasting associated with snow information. So this presentation really, I think, picks up from where Michael left off with his talk last time about all that invaluable snow survey information that's so crucial for water forecasting and water supply forecasting in the Western United States. So today I'm going to be talking about our river forecast centers in the United States, which have the primary role in providing that kind of water outlook for the US. The river forecast centers are under the umbrella of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they're actually part of the National Weather Service, those two logos that you see in the upper right of this graphic here. So the river forecast centers, in addition to having access to good real-time information about river flow conditions, they also have their fingers on the pulse of real-time weather information, both real-time weather information and weather forecast information for temperatures and precipitation across the United States. So they are the logical entity to basically utilize both the hydrologic and the meteorologic information to do the river forecasting work. There are 13 different river forecast centers in the United States that are responsible for forecasting in 13 different river basin areas of the country. This map shows 12 of those river forecast center regions for which the forecast centers provide their services. As you might imagine, across the United States, there's a wide variability in the kinds of hydrology and the drivers of hydrology in different river basins. For example, in the eastern United States, it's a much more humid region, much wetter region of the country, and there tends to be a lot more focus and concern related to flood flow forecasts. In contrast, in much of the western United States, relatively dry portion of the country, and there's a lot more focus and attention on water supply, given that it's often insufficient or less than folks would like to see for the water needs in the western US. But every river basin has its unique characteristics. For this particular discussion today, we're going to talk about the Colorado River Basin, for which the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center is responsible for doing flow projections. And one reason among our water experts team we've discussed that the Colorado River Basin might be a good example to discuss with you folks, because it seems to bear some similarities to some of the aspects of major river basins in Azerbaijan, at least to the limited extent that I'm familiar with that. For example, in the Colorado River Basin, it's strongly snowmelt dominated hydrology in this river basin. There is, of course, also a summer precipitation component, warm season precipitation component to the hydrology, but it is really the seasonal accumulation of snow at high elevations in the basin and the melting of that snow that drive most of the hydrology of this river basin. In addition, this Colorado River Basin is primarily an arid basin. I think the average basin-wide, the average annual precipitation is on the order of about 350 millimeters annually, but it's extremely variable across the basin. Most of that most of that precipitation falls at the high elevations in the mountainous areas that are mostly in the northern part of the river basin and are especially around sort of the edges of the basin outline that you see here. And many of the headwater areas, the mountainous areas, receive more than 1,000 millimeters of precipitation annually, as opposed to some of the dry, low elevation areas, especially in the southern part of the river basin, that receive 50 millimeters a year or less. So just an extraordinary amount of variability in spatially in terms of the amount of precipitation received in the basin. And again, mainly snowmelt driven hydrology. Another characteristic of the Colorado River Basin is that there are many, many reservoirs that store water and divert and store water within the river basin. Some of them are among the largest reservoirs in the United States. Collectively, all of the reservoirs within this river basin can store up to about 4 times the annual flow of the river. So it's really a substantially controlled flow in this river, which I think is similar to some in Azerbaijan as well. It is also predominantly, in terms of the water use, does go to agriculture. Roughly 80% of the consumptive use of water in the Colorado River Basin does go to agricultural irrigation. There is a lot of alfalfa production. There is a lot of irrigated grasslands. There is a lot of corn production. There's also rice and cotton and various nuts and other commercial products, but agriculture is the primary user. The other 20% of consumptive use does go to help support a population of about 40 million municipal water users and associated industrial use. And then finally, in the Colorado River Basin, I think one aspect of this basin, which perhaps is quite different from many of your major river basins in Azerbaijan, is that it is mostly surface water supplies for water use in the Colorado River Basin. There is some groundwater use, and groundwater is definitely an important component in certain portions of the Colorado River Basin, but overall, most of the water supply in the Colorado River Basin and most of the water use does come from surface water supplies. So that's some background and some description of the river basin we're going to look at as a case study here. As a quick reminder, this was also the same river basin that in our very first of these 3 sessions, when the presentation was done on developing basin plans, this was the example that Roman had walked through in one of these sessions. So we're talking, and similarly in Mike's presentation on snow measurement earlier this month, he also talked a lot about the Western US in general, but the Colorado River Basin in particular. So we've kind of kept returning to this river basin as a sort of a case study example for our discussions with you folks. So let's talk a little bit about the Colorado River Forecast Center. For today's talk, I wanted to talk about 2 different kinds of river forecasts that they provide for kind of 2 different time frames. One of those is seasonal forecasts that they provide for periods of weeks or months into the future in terms of estimates of total runoff. And the other is very short-term forecasts they provide for river flow on the order of the next 3 to 10 days. And I'll talk separately a little bit about both of these products that they provide. Oh, and one thing I wanted to say right up front, and this is a good time to do that, is that I do not work for a river forecast center. I have never worked for a river forecast center. I do not consider myself to be an expert in river forecast center models. It's a much better description for me is that I am a very happy and satisfied end user of river forecast center products and river forecast center models as part of my work, working with a lot of other river water users, reservoir operators, river managers, was that the products that the River Forecast Centers provided were absolutely invaluable for a lot of the work that we did to try to equitably utilize and share the available water that we had in the Colorado River Basin. But again, I'm not an expert in these models. My intent today is to provide hopefully a useful and interesting overview and introduction to the modeling that the River Forecast Centers do. I won't get too deeply into the details because some of those details, frankly, I'm not familiar with. And it's possible you will have some questions that I won't be able to answer about this modeling work. However, I think it would be very reasonable and possible for me to follow up on questions we do get with some of the River Forecast Center experts. But anyway, with that background, I want to make clear that I'm not the expert in these models. We thought it would be valuable in this exercise, again, to introduce you to the concepts that are used in these models. And particularly if there are, I guess I would encourage those of you sitting through this presentation, if there are particular elements or particular aspects of these models that really pique your interest, that are of particular interest to you, I hope that you will maybe make note of that. And I think it's very possible that we could work with the River Forecast Centers to provide more detailed information about those models of the elements of the models if you are interested in more follow-up on that. So consider this an introduction with the opportunity to identify some details that you might be interested in learning more about. So again, sort of two time frames in which the River Forecast Centers provide their outlooks for river flow. These seasonal forecasts are probabilistic forecasts, by which I mean a range of possible future flows is generated by the River Forecast Center with probabilities of different levels of runoff associated with that range. This addresses peak flood flows, it addresses low flows during the irrigation season, and it addresses seasonal water supply, overall seasonal water supply in the Western United States, where, as I mentioned, the total supply of water becomes a critical question in most years. And then at the more immediate time frame, in the next 3 to 10 days, the River Forecast Centers have a more deterministic model, by which I mean the models, rather than express forecast flows in terms of probabilities, they do provide a specific estimate for the daily flow at each of the locations in the model for each of the next 3 to 10 days. So both daily stream flow, and if it happens to be a period of the year where flood flows occur, then it would include the forecast peak or flood flow as well. So all this information is really important and provides a lot of invaluable information for a variety of interests in the Western United States and the Colorado River Basin. I mentioned that the federal government is a huge water manager in the Colorado River Basin. So in order to effectively manage their projects, these RFC forecasts are very important. I mentioned municipal providers, something on the order of 40 million people who rely on water from the Colorado River are also keenly interested in these forecasts. Hydropower production is a very important, very big deal in the Colorado River Basin. So they are very keenly interested in these forecasts. Agricultural irrigators, as I mentioned, is the largest single water use in the river basin, especially at the beginning, near the beginning of the irrigation season. It's very crucial to the agricultural community to have a good sense of how much water is likely to be available for their use throughout the growing season. So having good, reliable forecasts available are critical. Environmental and recreational interests. I mentioned that I had a seat at the table on behalf of the endangered fish in the Colorado River. It was certainly very crucial for me and for the interests I represented to have a sense as to how much water would be in the system. And then last, but certainly not least, river administration. Very, very critical in the Colorado River Basin. And it's really when I refer to administration, I'm referring to those those people in decision-making positions who have to determine when there's not sufficient water for everybody to get as much as they would like to use. These are the folks that make the decisions on who gets what, who gets water pursuant to the agreements and to the water rights that are in place for delivering that water. And this really operates at two levels. One is at the level of between the 7 different states that share the Colorado River. There are various agreements in place, a very complex body of law going back about 100 years now that that specifies how the 7 states will allocate the water that is available in the Colorado River, which in many years, and especially in recent years, is not sufficient to meet the supplies they would like to have or would like to utilize. So there are agreements between the 7 different states and our neighboring country of Mexico over allocation of the river, but there is also within each state, at the level of the state government, there are administrators that need to determine on a day-by-day basis who has the right to be able to divert water from the river during times of shortage or scarcity, and who doesn't, based on the existing water rights system established in each state. And for those river administrators, it's really critical for them to have reliable information, not just about current river flow, but also projected river flow in the next 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, because many times it may take that long, for example, for reservoir releases to reach their point of use farther downstream. So it becomes really a very challenging exercise for river administrators to manage the river consistent with everybody's water rights, and having these daily forecasts for flows becomes a critical tool for the work they do. So let's talk about that longer range, on the order of weeks to months into the future, water supply forecasts that I mentioned. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center does put out these water supply forecasts from approximately January 1st through July 1st of every year. In this river basin, most of the snow accumulation does take place from October through early April, and then most of the snow melt occurs from April through July. But beginning again in January, the River Forecast Center begins producing maps such as the one that you see on this slide that begin developing long-term water supply forecasts projected for the entire runoff season that is to come. So this is actually a screenshot of one of the RFC webpage maps. In this particular water supply forecast, each of those little triangles that you see on the map is a river gauging location for which the River Forecast Center has generated or is generating water supply forecasts that it will update daily throughout the January through July season. And these particular triangles on this map are color coded, showing the warmer colors like the orange and the red show locations where the seasonal runoff, so total seasonal water supply, is projected to be below normal. Some of the cooler colors, the purples and the blues, for example, show areas where the water supply is expected to be above normal. But a lot more detail is provided by the River Forecast Center. If one goes to this web page and clicks on one of these triangles, it brings up a graph that looks more or less like this. There's a lot going on in this graph, so let me just take a minute to describe what all is on here. On the horizontal axis is the time frame, so we're looking at one water year from October through September. On the vertical axis is the total estimated volume of runoff at this particular gauge location on the river system. And the solid green line that you see in the middle of the graph here shows the long-term average volume of runoff over the entire runoff season. The dashed green line towards the middle of the graph shows the median over the period of record. And then this blue swath that you see basically going from left to right as time advances on the graph shows what the River Forecast Center model is estimating day by day as we move through, in this case, the snow accumulation season. So it provides a median forecast, which is that blue line that traces across the graph. And it has a 90% probability of exceedance and a 10% probability of exceedance range that it shows. So for example, the bar that's pointed out here shows those estimates for January of 2019. Of course, as the season progresses, the RFC makes daily updates to these projections based on current basin conditions of snowpack and of soil moisture. This particular year was a year in which snowpack improved. The snowpack conditions improved beginning in January and got much better by the time we got to April or May. So it moved from a below normal to an above normal seasonal runoff forecast. So to generate these range of probabilities, the River Forecast Center has used what's called an ensemble stream flow prediction model. And that uses, again, that makes daily updates, and it uses historic temperature and precipitation records to develop this range of possible futures. And just conceptually, this is what the ensemble stream flow prediction model looks like. This is how it works. Perhaps in Azerbaijan, you use a very similar technique for a lot of your forecasts. Essentially, we know what the past stream flow is. We know what the current basin conditions are, where the arrow points to our moment in time. But the future is an unknown. We don't know what the sequence of future rainfall and precipitation is going to be in the future, which will determine what the total runoff will be, seasonal runoff will be in the basin. What the river forecast centers do, basically beginning with current basin conditions at that arrow, they take a historic sequence of 30 or 40 years historic time series of temperature and precipitation in the areas that affect runoff at this point in the basin. And they run each of those past 30 or 40 years through their model to create this ensemble of possible futures that they will see based on past history and past sequences of temperatures and precipitation. So you get this spaghetti distribution, spaghetti plot of a lot of different possible futures. So if I go back to the slide that I just showed you, that from that spaghetti plot of possible futures is where they come up with the median forecast, as well as the range of forecast of different probabilities from those multiple traces they have that they've run through their model. So that's the concept of the ensemble stream flow prediction, and that's the technique they use to come up with this probabilistic outlook for future runoff in the basin over the longer term. Obviously, as we progress farther and farther through the season, the total basin runoff becomes more accurate because we have less uncertainty associated with potential variability in future snow accumulation conditions. I mentioned the other shorter term product that the RFCs generate, which are these river flow forecasts. These are also forecasts that are updated daily, and these are also forecasts that are provided for many different river gauging locations throughout the Colorado River Basin. So again, this is a screenshot from the River Forecast Center website. Each of the blue dots on this map, again, shows a gauge location in the river system for which the River Forecast Center does provide these daily river flow forecasts. So all year round, each of these gauge locations can be queried for both the most recent forecast or recent stream flow and the latest forecast for stream flow over the next 7 to 10 days. And for these particular forecasts, rather than this probabilistic approach, there's a more deterministic model that the River Forecast Center uses that incorporates the latest projections for temperature and for precipitation over the next 7 to 10 days. And I'll briefly talk about what that entails. Again, if you click on one of those blue dots on that map, it will bring up a graph that looks something like this, which shows both the past flows at this particular gauge location in blue, that blue line, and then the green line, which shows the forecast flows for the next 7 to 10 days typically. And again, this is based on taking current conditions in each of the contributing subbasins in terms of snowpack and soil moisture, and layering on top of that the projected meteorological conditions for the next 7 to 10 days. I think 7 days of precipitation and 10 days of temperature. And they also factor in reservoir releases and water diversions in order to determine how that's going to affect flow at these particular gauge locations. There is a lot of water management that may be taking place upstream. And there are other gains and losses along river reaches that need to be incorporated into their model. And for context on each of these graphs, they do show the historic ranges of flows at each of these gauge locations so that the user can get a sense as to whether this is a below normal or approximately normal or above normal kind of hydrologic conditions that are being forecast for this river location. But again, these are generated for each of those points that I showed on that graphic. And again, the forecast flow for the coming 7 to 10 days. And again, this is the kind of information that river administrators pay a lot of attention to so that they can attempt to equitably allocate the water that is available in the river and that is committed to various water uses. I'll briefly describe the model that's used to come up with those forecast flows, river flows at all these different gauge locations. The model that the RFC uses uses lumped model parameters, by which I mean that the various subbasins within the model are represented as a single point that tries to average the conditions within that subbasin in terms of snow accumulation, in terms of soil moisture, in terms of projected temperature and precipitation. Tries to find an accurate means of averaging those conditions by subbasin. The primary two components of the RFC model is a snow accumulation and snow melt model. It's called Snow 17. And the second is a soil moisture accounting model, which is called SAC SMA. There are often other components such as reservoir storage and release components in the model, but these two features are really the key and the underpinning of the RFC modeling of river flows. And for the Colorado River Basin, it's a very complex model. There are 478 different river segments. There are 97 distinct reservoirs that are represented within the networked model. So it is quite a complex networked hydrologic model with a lot of information that goes into it. This is a schematic that just shows one small piece of that overall river basin model network. This is for one of the tributaries to the Colorado River. The rectangular boxes that you see here represent river reaches that are in the model. The sort of semicircular half moon that's on this schematic represents reservoir on this river system, with red arrows being representative of different diversions from the reservoir and from the river for water use. There are also return flows that come back to the system that are incorporated into the model, such as that magenta arrow near the top of the graphic showing water returning back to the river. So this is just an example of the networked model and the different features in terms of diversions and exports and return flows and reservoir management that go into running that model and representing the river system. To describe that a little bit more, each of those river segments that I showed for example, in that stick figure actually represent a specific contributing drainage area, contributing a subbasin. And so each river segment itself is actually divided into 2 or 3 different elevation zones that are used to model different characteristics of snow accumulation and runoff based on similar characteristics that they have. And again, as a lumped model, each of these zones is represented by a single point for purposes of precipitation and temperature input. But you have hundreds of these subbasins that are represented within the overall Colorado River model, and each of them again divided into separate elevation zones for modeling purposes. I mentioned that the 2 big components of the River Forecast Center models are this snow accumulation and melt model and this soil moisture accounting model. Each of these model components could easily be their own topic for a week-long seminar, a week-long workshop on modeling. So all I'm going to do here is just mention those 2 components of the model and show these schematics that just generally describe how they work. But the snow accumulation and melt model, represented by the graphic on the left, is basically driven by information about the aerial extent of snow cover and the amount of snow cover in each of the contributing basins, the kind of information that my water expert partner Mike Strobel talked about in our last presentation. And it's also driven by the daily precipitation and temperature that is either adding to that accumulated snow, or it's beginning to melt that accumulated snow and turn some of that snow melt into outflow from that river basin. So that's the snow component of the model. The graphic on the lower right represents the soil moisture accounting model. Again, very complex model that could be the topic of a week-long workshop, but for purposes of this discussion, it conceptually divides the soil profile into an upper zone and a lower zone, and then it models the movement of moisture and precipitation through that soil system, driven again by temperature and precipitation, and modeling changes in that water balance going to things like evapotranspiration, direct runoff, surface runoff, subsurface and base flow back to the river system. So again, the 2 big components, the snow accumulation and melt model and the soil moisture accounting model. The River Forecast Center, when I showed them these slides, suggested that I add this one to the presentation. This just kind of shows how the different pieces fit together. The long-term seasonal runoff model that I was describing first is represented in this box on the lower right. It's the ensemble stream flow prediction system. The shorter term 3 to 10 day river forecasts that I was describing are these daily operational forecasts shown in the box on the lower left. They do feed into each other, but crucial to the meaningful use of both of these models is the calibration of these models to historical data that are available for this river system and for each of these subbasins. And obviously the calibration step to make these models as representative as possible of this system is really crucial. In terms of calibrating this model, the River Forecast Center do select points in the river system where there is a long-term historical and real-time data that are available in terms of river flow. In addition, they try to pick locations to model that for which a number of water users have a lot of interest. Important points in the river system, for example, for allocating river flow or for determining who has the right to utilize that water. And then for each of these locations selected by the River Forecast Center, they do acquire a time series of data to use for calibrating the model that includes time series for precipitation, for temperature, and for stream flow. And in addition, they look at as much information as they can find related to reservoir use and historical diversions from the water system. An important point there is that there are some real challenges for the river forecast centers in terms of dealing with diversions of flow from the river system and incorporating those diversions into their models. One of the challenges is that there are hundreds of diversions of water out of the Colorado River system that need to be taken into account when trying to model river flow. Some of those are measured diversions where there is good real-time data about the rate of water diversion out of the river system, but many of those ditches, many of those canals that divert water from the river are not measured. There is no real-time data on how much water they are pulling out of the river that is reliable. And so the river forecast centers do have to make a lot of generalized assumptions and approximations in terms of what those unmeasured diversions amount to and how big of an impact they're having on the river flows. We'll say a little bit more about that. So in terms of doing the model calibration, the river forecast centers do work to determine the optimal set of parameters to use for each model and for each elevation zone, for each of those subbasins I mentioned, for simulating unregulated flow at each point in their model. I mentioned this challenge of measured versus unmeasured diversions and depletions. Where there are measured diversions or imports of water or exports of water from the basin, those can then be added or subtracted to this unregulated flow that they simulate in the river. This challenge of unmeasured depletions requires the river forecast centers use other tools, such as looking at historic data and trying to estimate what those unmeasured depletions are as a function of the irrigated areas that they serve, the quantity of hectares that are being irrigated by that diversion, along with temperature that's going to be driving the consumptive use by the crops, in order to better estimate the amount diverted and the amount returning back to the river as part of their adjustments to these daily flow estimates that they generate. In addition, for calibration, they have to use other techniques. Obviously, there's a very limited number of locations in a river basin where you actually have measured precipitation or measured temperature. And so other tools are required to be able to more effectively interpolate and extrapolate temperature and precipitation based on a limited number of measured points. And so they have, for example, a climate data set that's been compiled from historic records that goes by the acronym PRISM, that's used to help do some of that interpolation and extrapolation based on a limited number of actual measured points. From that, for each sub area that I showed in sub-watershed, they do calculate a mean aerial precipitation and a mean aerial temperature, which again drives the model. SNOTEL stations and other snow data. Again, the kind of information that Michael discussed in his session earlier this month is crucial and provides really good quality data for especially the higher elevation sites. Evaporation is a term in the model that is calculated as part of the water balance determination. And then finally, when this model is run in the upper part of the basin, they force the model with 6-hourly precipitation and temperature values, and in the lower basin on an even finer temporal scale, as that part of the basin is more subject to flash flooding associated with summer storms. So that's a quick and dirty description of the calibration, some of the calibration approaches and challenges that the river forecast centers have. Models, of course, are only models. By definition, they're very imperfect. They're going to have errors. Many of those errors are associated with the calibration process of trying to accurately calibrate a model. Just very briefly, the big calibration errors and challenges that the RFCs face are associated with the data themselves and with the model itself. In terms of the data, there are just data itself is not 100% accurate, and there are often errors in the data that are used from the model calibration. And probably more significantly, there are only so many points in space for which you have good data on things like historic precipitation and historic temperature. So the density of reliable measured points you have relative to the area you're trying to cover makes accurate calibration difficult. From the standpoint of the model, it is a conceptual model, so many of the parameters in the model have to be estimated and may be difficult or impossible to measure. And we're talking about a hydrologic model at a very large scale, very large spatial scale, that can't capture all of the subtleties and nuances of basin characteristics at much smaller spatial scales. There's a lot of generalization that needs to happen. There's a lot of lumping of characteristics, spatial characteristics together at larger scales that inevitably introduce some of the errors, calibration errors into the model. So that's really my quick overview and very general introduction to the modeling approach or approaches that are taken by the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. Again, I think if there's any interest on the part of folks sitting in on this presentation and learning more about particular aspects or details of those models, I think we could likely make arrangements with the river forecast centers to provide more of that kind of information, but wanted to provide this as an introduction. This is a snapshot of the River Forecast Center website, and this is the web address if anybody wants to go directly to the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center website just to explore and to poke around and to see what kind of information they have. There's actually a lot there besides just the flow forecasts that I mentioned. Some of the other products they provide on site include the peak flow forecast or flood forecasts. It includes updated information on snow conditions throughout the river basin, including the SNOTEL stations, snow water equivalents, and percent of normal conditions as we progress through the snow accumulation season. They provide maps showing anomalies in temperature and precipitation relative to historic conditions. Are we having an above normal precipitation year? Are we having a below normal year? Are temperatures, likewise, are temperatures above or below normal? That kind of information is shown in real time on this webpage. They also provide information about reservoir conditions, both current and recent storage and storage elevation levels. And they provide outlooks. Obviously, these outlooks feed into their models, but if if visitors to their webpage simply want to take a look specifically at what the temperature and precipitation outlooks are, that's provided on this website as well, along with probabilistic outlooks in terms of whether conditions are likely to remain warmer and wetter or cooler and drier than in the average past year. So again, that's a lot of modeling complexity that I've tried to discuss in a very short amount of time, very generalized and very introductory overview, but hopefully of interest to folks on this call in terms of the techniques that the River Forecast Center uses. And again, if there may be particular details associated with these modeling approaches, is something that potentially we could delve into in more detail at a later time. But I guess that's all I have to say for now. Elizabeth, if you want to open it up for any questions from anybody. As I say, I may or may not be able to answer them since I'm not an RFC expert, but I'll be happy to try.
Thanks so much, Don, and thank you for that excellent presentation and overview of the River Forecast Centers and some of the modeling and techniques that they use for their forecasts. So as Don mentioned, we do now have time for questions. I dare you to ask him really difficult ones so that he has to try to answer them. No, I'm just kidding. But we are happy to answer whatever questions you do have. And if we don't have the answers, we can follow up with experts at the forecast centers or elsewhere in the US government to get those answers. So don't be shy. And while folks are thinking of questions, which they can put in the chat, or you can use the raise hand icon to indicate that you would like to ask a question, I also welcome thoughts and comments from any of the other experts who we have joining us today who have returned from some of the previous sessions. So we'll give folks a few minutes to collect their thoughts. I'm sure that it was a lot to process in a very short amount of time. I see a hand from Asif. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Mən də hər birinizi salamlayıram.
Greetings to everyone. For us, it's morning, so it's like good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to Dawn for a very interesting presentation on this modeling. The model that is used on Colorado River. I want to share my thoughts, my comments. Azerbaijan rivers have large flood streams during the spring and summer months. At the end of March and starting from the April, by mid of June in our rivers, we have waterly or mass waterly seasons for the rivers as a result of the snow melting in the highlands because of the temperature of the high rain seasons. That's why this period for us is called large inflow periods. In the Southern Caucasus, the largest river is Kura River, and Kura River passes through 3 countries. It starts from Turkey, then from Georgia, and comes to Azerbaijan, and then goes to Caspian Sea. This is transborder river, and to give hydrological forecast for this river is very important for us, but at the same time, it's very complicated and very difficult. Because since it passes through the neighboring territories, we don't do forecasts without their information, and that's why there are cascade water reservoirs on this river, and it is very difficult and complicated to give forecasts related to those reservoirs, but nevertheless, we have some information about accumulated snow and precipitations in the neighboring countries. We get all this information from our neighbors, and also we do snow measuring activities in our highlands. And at the end of March, beginning of April, we can forecast how much water will enter through Kura to the country. And that's why energy resources, melioration, irrigation, and water users can plan their work based on this data. But of course, we have some difficulties. And what are these difficulties? On Kura River, we give up to 10 days forecast, short period, as Don mentioned. This is short period. And we also do seasonal type of forecast. But on seasonal forecast, how true they are, it's not always right, because precipitation level, how it will be forecasted, it's a bit difficult for us. Why I mentioned this? So we mostly use this data as you do, based on statistical data, and gives this forecast. Actually, I have many questions, but my first question is, the forecast for Colorado River, what is the percentage of their being true, their realization? It includes both for the short and seasonal forecasts. What percentage you can say that they are true?
Okay, that's a wonderful and very basic question. How good are these models? And that's a very difficult question to answer, because you're talking about a lot of different river locations, a lot of different seasons of the year, and a lot of different hydrologic conditions, dry years versus wet years, where you're trying to forecast accurately. So I don't know if I could give you a number or a percentage that would be meaningful, even if I did work for a river forecast center and had all that information at my fingertips. But from the standpoint of being a user of this information, an end user of the information, I think generally there's been a great deal of appreciation for the quality of these river forecasts. It's a difficult river basin to forecast in terms of seasonal runoff, because it is such a there is so much variability in snow accumulation from one year to the next, and just a handful of large storms, just a very few 2 or 3 large storms during the snow accumulation season, can make a huge difference in terms of water supply in this river basin. So just a very few storm events can greatly change the hydrologic condition, which makes it very difficult to forecast water supply for a long period of time in advance. In addition, we are seeing, I think the river forecast centers would acknowledge that, especially in the last 10 and 20 years, we have seen an aridification, a drying of the river basin with climate change, in which one of the most notable new challenges that they face are very dry soil moisture conditions with much higher frequency than we used to see in the past because of climate warming and warming temperatures. The so-called efficiency of snowmelt, that is the amount of snowmelt that actually becomes river flow, has really declined a lot in recent years because of warmer basin conditions and drier soil conditions that have created this situation where in some recent years the soils, when we begin the snowmelt season, have become almost like sponges that soak up a lot more of the available snowmelt before it can reach the rivers. And there's also an increase in evapotranspiration from vegetation with the warmer temperatures. So I think while in general, the River Forecast Center models and projections have been quite good over the years, they definitely face some real challenges in recent years with a warming climate to try to keep up with what seems to be a real change in the hydrologic response and hydrologic characteristics of the Colorado Basin. So I don't know if that's a very good answer to your question, but I think that's kind of my perspective on the value of the RFC's models. They've been generally very useful. They're certainly not perfect, but they're the best tools we have. But the River Forecast Centers do face real challenges with a warming climate changing the hydrology.
I hope that answered your question, Asif. I see your hand is still up, and I know you mentioned you had a couple other questions. So if you'd like to ask another, please.
Çok sağ olun suala cevap için. Ben de sizden
Thank you very much. I fully agree with you. It's very difficult to do a seasonal hydrological forecast because climate change also impacts it, and it's very difficult to forecast what will be precipitations, what will be temperature. For short period, yes, of course. We have high percentage of them being accurate than seasonal ones. So what I want to say, there is a regional flash blue guidance system model that is being developed between United States hydrological experts and World Meteorological Center. And the soil wetness as well as snow equivalency and forecasts based on 3 models are included to this guidance, WRF, and one other. Based on this, next 6 hours forecasts are given, considering all these parameters. And in Azerbaijan, we already started using this model, and yes, we need to have some trainings to get used to this model, how to fully be able to use it. This is something new for us, but I'm sure that in the nearest future, we will be able to use that model fully. Because it will help us to forecast the floodings in the rivers. So sometimes during summer months, we have long drought systems, and the soil dryness becomes very important aspect. And sometimes you see we have very high rain precipitations, which leads to floods. And actually, it cannot be forecasted in advance. And I want to keep in touch with you. How can we get your presentations? Also, if we have additional questions, we would like to come back to you. Also, if possible, we would like to get in contact with people who are doing this modeling. How can we do it? Because in Azerbaijan, as a pilot project, we may apply this this model to one of our rivers. because we have very similar rivers in Azerbaijan with snow accumulation is in highlands, etc. So it would be good if we could continue this collaboration with you. Thank you very much. I I will have more questions, but as Mr. Don said, he is not subject matter expert here. That's why, if possible, we want to keep in touch. I want to ask all my questions to the experts on modeling additionally to research them. I will write down my email to chat box. If possible, we can get in contact with you. Thank you very much. Thank you for very interesting presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Asif. I think that's exactly what we're hoping with this presentation, that it would hopefully identify or trigger some of your specific interests and questions, and that we could use that to hopefully follow up with the real experts in this modeling and see whether we can, if the interest is there on your part, and it sounds like it is, to see whether we could get more assistance from the modeling experts to help answer more of your questions, which I'm actually very eager to see, very specifically what kinds of additional follow-up questions you have and what specific topics you're interested in. So absolutely, I think, again, I can't speak for the river forecast centers because I do not work for them, but I have a lot of contacts there and have already given them a heads up that we are having these conversations with Azerbaijan, and I suspect that they would be happy to be able to provide at least some level of support and possibly some training, or at a minimum answer many of your questions related to the modeling. So that's great. Please do pass along any questions you have or requests for more information. That would be great. And I'm not myself very familiar with some of the flood modeling tools that the river forecast centers use, or the ones you were mentioning that you've been using and learning to use there in Azerbaijan, but certainly the river forecast centers here in the United States would have that kind of expertise. I will note that one interesting, speaking of unanticipated floods or difficult to forecast flood events in the Colorado River Basin, another challenge we've had is that with a warming and a drying climate, we're seeing a lot more uncontrolled wildfires that burn through forest areas in the watershed. And as you know, that has a huge hydrologic impact on runoff and on how those burned areas respond to storm events. Once you get those wildfires burning through large forest areas, creating those hydrophobic soils, you can suddenly generate some pretty amazing amounts of runoff from relatively small areas during very intense storms. As you mentioned, you're seeing some of these very intense rain events in Azerbaijan that are difficult to forecast and anticipate. And I should just mention that the increase in forest fires that we're seeing on the landscape in the Colorado Basin are sort of adding to that uncertainty and that flash flood response in many smaller river basins, which creates further complications in terms of trying to anticipate and model how the watershed will respond hydrologically.
Thanks, Dawn. And just to chime in here, I put in the chat, please feel free to send questions to my email address, which I have put in the chat as egoffey@ios.doi.gov. And I would be more than happy to connect you with any of the experts that have spoken during the series so far, and to connect further within the US government and elsewhere where the real expertise lies as needed. I think we've said before that this is just the beginning of the conversation, and we are very excited about the potential opportunity to continue to collaborate with Azerbaijan in the future. So please do follow up with us and we will stay in touch. Asif's hand's still up, but I think he said he's going to hold his questions for the experts. So does anyone else have any questions they would like to add at this time? And even if not questions, we also welcome comments or thoughts about how the information you've heard today might be relevant to you and your work in Azerbaijan. Letting folks take another minute or two to think of any potential questions they might have. Again, we will send out a copy of the presentation as well as a recording link through the embassy, so you all will have access to it going forward to use as a reference or to think of any potential questions to follow up with later. And we do still have one more session in this series, which will be taking place on December 13th. So in just a couple, or December 14th, I believe, for you guys, 13th for us. So Mike, would you mind giving a quick intro to what you plan to be speaking about during that last session?
Certainly, thank you. During this last session, what we're going to do is cover some of the conservation practices that are provided by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, who I work with, that are related to water resources. So things that that can impact agriculture and the water resources associated with that will be covered through these different conservation practices. Many of these are designed for implementation on the farm and are areas that others can have access to this information and utilize these types of practices for their own needs. So I will cover just a kind of a basic overview of these different opportunities to improve and develop water resources on a farm-by-farm basis that will potentially impact both the water resources and the viability of agriculture in any region.
Thanks, Mike. I think I can speak for many of us when I say that the models and forecasts can sometimes be intimidating or scary in terms of what the future might look like for some of us in terms of our access to water. And so knowing that there are solutions or ways to manage water better, to perhaps make better use of the water that we will have is certainly a positive note to end the series on. So I look forward to that session in a few weeks. Taking a final call for any last questions. Otherwise, I think we are quickly heading towards the end of today's program. Seeing none in the chat and hearing none, I think I will go ahead and say that we will wrap up today's session. And I want to wish everyone on the US side and elsewise a wonderful Thanksgiving, which we will be celebrating here in the United States on Thursday, and say that I look forward to hopefully seeing everyone again in a few weeks for the fourth and final session of this series. And thank you so much to all of our participants from Azerbaijan. Thank you to the embassy for helping to coordinate and facilitate these sessions. And thank you to our interpreter for making us be able to understand each other well. And thank you to the experts for providing their expertise and their time. Thanks to everyone, and see you all in a few weeks.
Thank you, Elizabeth.